Okay, I'm Thomas Brophy, President of the Institute of Nordic Sciences and President Emeritus of California Institute for Human Science. I'm chairing this session. I'm the third presenter, and we have 6, so that means 20 minutes, including Q&A for each presenter. And first, we have Tiffeny Todd.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Dr. Tiffeny Todd. I am Associate Professor of Physics at Pierce College in Washington. I did my PhD at the University of California, Irvine, where I did theoretical modeling on the radical pair mechanism, which features centrally in the theory that I'm going to be presenting today. My theory is called Vacuum Orchestrated Spin Sensing, and it is a quantum mechanism for non-local consciousness. My agenda for today is I'm going to propose an empirical mechanism by which physical components, i.e. atoms, can become conscious agents, meaning ourselves, minds, brains. I'm going to define what I mean by consciousness. I'm going to suggest that consciousness exists in the quantum vacuum, and I'm going to propose a mechanism by which the thoughts and information in the quantum vacuum can actually be transmitted to the brain and other living structures. So first of all, what is consciousness? I'm going to focus on cognitive agency, which is an entity. A cognitive agent is an entity that can learn to reach the same goal by different means. So learning is critical here. It's a mental process that involves acquiring new knowledge and understanding. And I'm going to focus specifically on a higher level of learning, which is associative learning, because that involves 3 key components: perception in the now, sensing in the now, as well as memory, drawing associations from the past, as well as imagination, being able to conceptualize the future. And probably the most famous experiment to assess whether an entity possesses the ability for associative learning is going to be the Pavlovian dog experiment, where the dog will salivate when presented with dinner. However, if you present the dog with a bell before dinner, eventually the dog will salivate just upon hearing the bell, because the dog is associating the bell with the onset of dinner. And so there's a broad assumption that only complex animals are capable of associative learning, but I'm going to question that. There is research that even all the way down to single-cell organisms have the ability to change their mind. When a pollutant is introduced into their environment, they try multiple hierarchical strategies in order to avoid that pollutant. So I think we can safely say that animals at all levels are capable of associative learning. What about plants? You might think, well, that's crazy to think that plants can learn. They don't have a nervous system, they don't have brains. But in fact, Pavlovian conditioning has been demonstrated with plants, where if the plant bends towards the light, if you introduce a fan, the plant will learn within 3 days that the direction of the fan indicates the direction the light will come, and it will bend only towards the fan. So the question then is, how can a plant learn? Where do mental processes of memory and imagination exist, if not in a neural network? And I'm going to give a couple more examples of why I don't think that memories exist solely in a neural network. A butterfly can recall Pavlovian conditioning that it learned as a caterpillar, even though during the process of metamorphosis its brain is liquefied and reconstituted. Similarly, a regenerative worm remembers a maze it was conditioned to learn to find food, even after it's been decapitated and its head grows back. It still has those memories. So where could these memories exist? Well, we have an answer from a researcher, Michael Levin, from Tufts University, who found that there is a voltage map that reflects memories, both anatomical and conditioned. Now, to explain what voltage is in a cell, ions, which are simply atoms with a charge imbalance, can flow in and out of a cell, sort of like giving the cell a charge, like a higher voltage or a lower voltage. And when an embryo is developing, initially all of the cells are identical. But at some point, the cells need to differentiate. And how they do that is by acquiring a voltage that corresponds to the organ or the part of the body that they're going to become. So here you see the head, the mid part, and the tail have different voltages. This voltage map is so significant that if you change the voltage of a tail cell in an embryo to the voltage of a head cell, you can create a worm with heads at both ends. The worm, as well as its offspring, will continue to have two heads at both ends. What's important to keep in mind here is that this information is not in the DNA. We've mapped the genome, including the human genome, and the DNA only tells cells what proteins to make, the hardware. It doesn't give the software information. So we can safely say from numerous experiments by Michael Levin that anatomical as well as condition memory is reflected in this voltage map within cells. Keep in mind that how do we measure thoughts with the capacity that we have right now? The only measure we have of a thought at this point is a voltage change within a neuron. It's an action potential, it's a voltage spike. That's what brain waves are. They're oscillations in the voltages of cells. That's what thoughts are from a scientific perspective as we know so far. So we're looking for what is the cause, what could be the cause of this voltage change, and where does the information for this map come from, if not from the DNA? How far down does this agency, does this consciousness go? Surely not to the molecular level, the level of molecules, which are just assemblies of atoms. But indeed, Michael Levin as well found that no, we do find evidence of cognitive agency, of associative learning at the molecular level, specifically with gene regulatory networks. Basically, a gene regulatory network we used to think of as a basic chemical reaction, a cascade of reactions that were perfectly predictable. But in fact, it was found that you can actually train these networks of proteins, which are just collections of molecules, you can train them to respond to a placebo as if it were the drug itself. So let's look at this a little bit more closely in case you don't know what a gene regulatory network is. All of the cells in our body have all of the same genes. However, only some of them are expressed at any one point in time. So there are genes in my stomach which produce acid. I have those same genes in my eye, but I wouldn't want those genes in my eye to be turned on and my eye to start producing acid. So gene regulatory networks regulate which genes are turned on based on the function of the cell. And we have these complicated circuit diagrams that we've tried to map to understand what gene affects, or what protein turns on what gene, which affects what gene in after. And we've come to find out that this is an oversimplification, this circuit-like predictability, and that in fact genes as well as proteins behave in unpredictable ways, shape-shifting to perform varied functions unpredictably even under the same environmental conditions. So I would contend that even at the molecular level, we're seeing evidence of consciousness, evidence of conscious agency. Now, other quantum models of consciousness suggest that consciousness arises from larger structures at the level of tubulin or microtubules, which are large constructions of protein, filaments, skeletal filaments that give structure to the cell, or even collections of neurons, microcolumns. And if we're seeing evidence of consciousness at the molecular level, then I think that these levels are going to be too high to account for the emergence of consciousness. We need to look for an emergence of consciousness at the atomic level, and that's what I'm going to propose today. So the question is, can we see evidence of conscious agency at the atomic level? And just to be clear, what do I mean by the atomic level? Everything in our physical world is made up of atoms. I'm going to leave out the other particles in the standard model for simplicity's sake. Let's just focus on what makes up an atom: an electron, a proton, and, importantly, bursts of light that emerge from the quantum vacuum to hold them together. Let's explore the quantum vacuum. The quantum vacuum is not a theory, it is fundamental to quantum field theory. Our equations for quantum field theory in the standard model don't work unless we account for the fluctuations of the quantum vacuum, these virtual particle fluctuations. Virtual particles, I'm going to focus on virtual photons, constantly appear and disappear from the quantum vacuum. They're the force carriers of the electromagnetic force. It's what causes a negative and a positive charge to be attracted together. They exchange virtual photons. Now, typically, when we have empty space, the fluctuations of virtual particles are completely random, as shown in the first picture here. But in the presence of charged particles, the behavior of these virtual particles changes in response to the presence of certain charged particles. Those virtual particles are exchanged to cause them to attract. Now, this calculation is actually more complicated in quantum field theory. Sometimes there could be repulsion and not just attraction. There could be a myriad of other interactions that could happen between a proton and an electron, but on average, when we average that up, we take a Feynman path integral, the average effect is that we have attraction between this proton and the electron. But again, it's these virtual particles that are almost responding to information in the vacuum that causes that attraction to occur. So my question is it possible, I want to point out that the standard model has only been tested in non-living structures. Is it possible that in living structures, we have a slight deviation from that probability distribution that we see in inorganic systems? And specifically, I think that this deviation could occur with quantum field fluctuations interacting with radical pairs. Radical pairs are the only known quantum object in living systems. They are in effect a quantum antenna. So briefly, what is a radical pair? You can have two atoms and one exchanges an electron. The charge imbalance creates an imbalance of spins. I've indicated them here as like little antennas. Those are entangled spins, and that constitutes a quantum object. That radical pair is going to be sensitive to virtual photons. It's going to be sensitive to quantum vacuum fluctuations. It's where it can relegate what happens in a chemical reaction. And the outcome, the binary outcome of that chemical reaction constitutes a signal that can lead to an a neuron firing or a neuron not firing. There are a number of indications of why radical pairs are implicated in consciousness. I'm going to briefly talk about anesthetics. Anesthetics have an isotope dependence, which can be explained by a radical pair model. Radical pairs have also been implicated in how ion channels open and close, and the references are here. Radical pairs have also been implicated in controlling the efficiency of protein-DNA interactions, which could explain how they could affect gene regulatory networks. Now, it may seem crazy what I'm proposing. I'm proposing that our minds, our thoughts, exist in the quantum vacuum, and that they're being projected to our brains. And that sounds outlandish, but we actually do have evidence that thoughts can affect quantum fluctuations. A recent experiment found that with pure intention, participants were able to affect quantum tunneling. And what they were asked to do is to control a random number generator. Think a coin flip. They were asked to move the arrow more to the right with their brains. And once the left side of their brain was temporarily disabled, let's say, the effect of this ability to control a quantum process, to control the quantum tunneling, the outcome of that quantum tunneling, achieved a significance, a p-value of 0.006, which is the highest p-value of any psi experiment ever performed. Keep in mind, this was the third replication of this study. So we have evidence that thoughts can affect quantum vacuum fluctuations. So I have a hypothesis that we don't yes, it seems outlandish to say that my mind exists in the quantum vacuum, but I feel like I'm my body, right? I feel like I'm my body. Well, if you've ever heard of the rubber hand experiment, you'll know that within just 1 minute, by stroking a hand and a rubber hand, a person thinks very quickly that the rubber hand is them, is their body, and actually reacts physiologically if that rubber hand becomes threatened. So I think decoupling the conscious agents focus on manipulating virtual photon interactions with the brain enhances the brain's ability to interact virtual photons in other quantum systems. The last thing I'll leave you with is relativistic quantum information within the past 2 decades is a new field of physics that is probing the quantum vacuum and is validating what I just presented and is explaining how what I just presented in the last experiment could be possible. We now know that information in the quantum vacuum is entangled across space and time, and you can think of the entangled electron spins of a radical pair as split views of the same underlying quantum information, the same thought within a quantum field. And in relativistic quantum information, they now have experiments in which distant, space-like separated objects, meaning outside a light cone where they could signal one another or be affected by one another, you can indeed still entangle those objects, even though they've never met, by harnessing entanglement via the quantum vacuum. And I'm proposing that the radical pair could be just such a quantum antenna that could harvest this quantum entanglement and harvest the entanglement from the vacuum. So just to summarize what vacuum orchestrated spin signaling is, I'm proposing that cognitive agency originates in the quantum vacuum as an information stream. That these thoughts from the quantum vacuum are signaled to neurons from the vacuum via the bursts of light, the virtual photons, the quantum vacuum fluctuations that emerge from the quantum vacuum. I'm proposing that these virtual photons alter the orientation of spin pairs, parallel or anti-parallel, and that triggers a neuron to fire or not fire. How my model differs from other models of consciousness, other models of quantum consciousness most presume that there is a proto-consciousness and that somehow the cognition is occurring through some sort of quantum computation in the brain. I'm arguing that no, that the computation, that the cognition is happening in the quantum vacuum and a subset of that information is being signaled to the brain. I'm arguing that there are other informational signals in the quantum vacuum that aren't being signaled to brains, but that could be picked up by the brains. And I think that this model definitely solves the hard problem of how a complex consciousness could then emerge into a subset into the consciousness that we know as ourselves. If you'd like more information, please visit psychicphysics.com. There you can download a free study guide and infogram which details all of the points of VOSS theory. You can also stream a new documentary that was produced on this theory. It's now streaming on demand at the website. Thank you.
Time for 2 minutes for.
Yes. Or you, okay, yes, I saw you first. And we should probably.
I can speak loud.
Great, perfect.
Okay. What is your view of the collapse of the wave function?
I don't think there's a collapse of the wave function. I think relativistic quantum information theory is really pointing to the fact that the Copenhagen interpretation is the wrong interpretation of quantum mechanics. And I think we need to look at the pilot wave interpretation that Bohm presented. In the pilot wave interpretation of quantum mechanics, the particles, if you think of a double slit experiment, right? Or in the Copenhagen interpretation, we say that waves become things, they collapse into things. Things are in a superposition until we measure them and they collapse into things. What the Copenhagen interpretation actually says is that mathematically speaking, all we know is that the probability of a particle being in a certain state varies like a wave. Not that the particle is a wave and collapses. We've never measured a superposition. We only measure actual particles in actual positions. How the pilot wave theory, or Bohmian mechanics, solves this is it says that waves don't collapse into things, but things are guided by waves. I encourage you to view, you saw one of the demonstrations of the oil drop experiment where you can see how fluid dynamics using this pilot wave model can help you intuitively understand the double slit experiment, quantum tunneling, and a myriad of other sort of odd behaviors in quantum mechanics. But what's most important is that the pilot wave is completely non-local, meaning that the pilot wave has information about every particle in the universe, and if one particle changes, the whole wave updates with that information. I think that's why it was disfavored, and the Copenhagen interpretation was favored, because non-locality competes with general relativity. And so it's a more complicated theory, but mathematically the pilot wave interpretation is mathematically equivalent to the Copenhagen interpretation. You don't have a wave function collapse, you solve the measurement problem, and I hope that answers your question.
It does, thank you.
Who's next? Sorry.
Just in regards to vacuum fluctuations,
Yes.
and another way to potentially think about that is like fluctuations in the Higgs field. Are those two things synonymous with each other?
So, vacuum fluctuations, I focused on virtual particles, but all particles are popping in and out of existence. The difference is the time that they last, depends on the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. So there's a limit to the energy and the time. So the larger the energy of a particle, the shorter the time it can exist as a virtual particle pair. So things like electrons, a Higgs boson, that is going to exist for 10 to the negative 12 or less fractions of a second. Whereas the virtual photons that I am proposing to signal the radical pairs would be of radio frequency. We have experiments showing that radical pairs are sensitive to radio frequencies. And those would last up to a second. And the radical pair lifetime is about a fraction of a second, so there's plenty of time for that interaction to occur. So virtual fluctuations, yes, you could get a Higgs boson, but that's a very big energy, a very big particle. You'll never see it. You don't see virtual particles, and it won't really have much of an effect.
Okay, we have time.
Sorry. Okay. Sorry. And any other questions, you can contact me at the website. I'd be happy to provide email answers. Thank you.